The second group of research ethics standards are related to protecting the science from malevolent researchers who want to publish when they don't really have any good data. And we'll take a look quickly at those additional standards. Some ethical standards are related to the use of psychometric tests and measures. These standards are set by the International Test Commission. They are relevant to researchers and practitioners who use psychometric measures. They are kind of straightforward. You should only use the tools that you are trained in, only use them for their proper aims, make very specific and limited interpretations. Do not make interpretations that the test does not allow you or that are not supported by previous studies of the test validity. Use correct test norms to avoid discriminating between groups. If, for example, males and females or ethnic majority and ethnic minority react in different ways to the questions, the scores might not be comparable, and it may result in discrimination based on test scores. And of course, results of the test should be confidential. If they are not completely confidential, participants should always know who is going to have access to the results and how the results are going to be used. For example, if the management is going to have these results and is going to know who gave which answer, you need to let people know. And of course, test materials should also be secure. They should not be published openly, for example, online. Unfortunately, especially in Russia, we have very many instances when these norms are violated. Some norms are specific to research. If you use someone else's instrument, you need to have a permission to use it. Sometimes this is very straightforward. For example, if an instrument is published completely, all the questions and all the keys in a research paper, you can kind of assume that the author made it openly available for anyone, at least for non-commercial research purposes. But if you want to use it for commercial aims, you need to obtain a permission. Maybe you need to pay some license fee. If you are not sure, for example, you got this test from a colleague or you found it online, unless it's a very old test where the author is not alive anymore. But even in that case, you need to contact a copyright holder. It may be the author himself or herself, or it may be some kind of test publishing company. And you need to have permission to use this instrument. There are some very notorious cases, again in the States, when people used some instruments that they assumed was openly available, but then after the paper was published, the author emerged and said, pay $2 or something for every participant, or your paper needs to be retracted. And several papers were retracted because the authors chose not to pay that absolutely notorious fee. So I hope none of us ever faces this awful situation. But this is why the issue of permissions needs to be taken seriously. Also, if you make a modification in a measure, you change a response scale, or you have lost some question when you entered your questionnaire in an online form, just mention it. Mention it for the people to be able to compare your data to other studies. And sometimes we have tools that are only aimed for research. Some questionnaires that did not yet receive enough research attention, when it's not really clear what their scores mean or how they relate to real psychological processes. It's totally legit and okay to use these tools in research, but we should prevent them from spreading into practice. We should prevent people from using them, for example, to diagnose children at school and give conclusions to parents. This would be unethical. You can actually look up these ethical standards of International Test Commission, and there are also other bodies like American Educational Research Association that formulate these very specific guidelines and very large and very comprehensive. And if you suspect that someone is violating these norms, it makes sense to confront them and to make sure that they are aware that they are doing something unethical. And some examples of unethical behavior relate to science as a whole. I will, like a Virgil, I will guide you through this scientific hell where in different circles we have different culprits, malevolent scientists who have conducted different kinds of scientific violations. The less severe violations are violations against authorship or copyright. When people plagiarize, this is obviously very bad. Sometimes people give wrong credits of authorship. For example, they fail to include someone as an author, and then that person may complain and the paper will get retracted by the journal. Or maybe they include additional authors who really did nothing to do with the paper. Especially in some developing countries, there is this awful practice of selling places on the list of authors, like in China or in Russia. I've seen also those examples. This is completely unethical. And the American Psychological Association defines very clearly who an author is. An author is a person who has made a substantial contribution to research, without whose participation the research would not emerge as it was. And that person needs to have read the paper and to take responsibility for its content and agree with their position in the list of authors. If a person has not read the paper, or you cannot contact them, it is safer to list them in acknowledgements section. Just say thank you for this and this, because otherwise, if they emerge and complain that they don't really agree with this paper, you will have a problem as an author, because again, the paper might get retracted. And the third type of problems, when we use other people's products or methods or data without permission. Also, very bad for us, and definitely a killer for our papers if this is discovered. But this was not as awful, because those violations kind of are bad for individuals whose copyright or whose authorship rights are infringed. The more severe violations concern scientific integrity. They harm the science. The least severe of those is self-plagiarism, when we publish the same result twice. This is something that we should not do at all costs. If you have published the result once, it's already rotten fish. It's already published. Don't publish it anymore. But of course, there are situations very often when we have a very large data set and you can conduct several different studies or test several different research questions using the same data set. This is completely fine. Or you have tested a research question using an older method, but now you want to come back to it and use a newer method. Just refer to your previous work so that your readers and your editors know that this has already been tested to some extent, but then the editors and the readers will judge whether this is an important finding. But why is this essential? Because if you don't acknowledge your other papers based on the same data set, people who do a meta-analysis, for example, they might consider this data set as two independent studies, which will result in biased estimates of experimental effects. This is why we always need to be very clear about it. The most severe violation against scientific integrity is data fabrication. Data fabrication when researchers just come up with numbers that don't really come from actual research. Maybe you've heard about the very notorious case of Diederik Stapel, a Dutch social psychologist who worked in the very great university, I think it was Tilburg actually, and colleagues who worked with him described how he did it. He basically took questionnaires and he came back with completed questionnaires or with raw data, but it turns out that he did not actually use real participants, or he used very few, and he just copied the same answers over and over. It's strange that this was not discovered for some years. But when this was finally discovered, when people had suspicions about the integrity of his data, he was asked to provide the raw data, which he obviously could not provide. And this way it came out, and he was dismissed from the university. He had to also refund his research grants, and he had to abandon his career as a scientist. And he wrote a memoir, which in Dutch is called My Downfall. In English, I think it's called something like A History of Fraud in Science. It's easy to find. His name is Diederik Stapel. And in this memoir, he describes how he actually came to this, because he was extremely motivated to conduct good, interesting research. And one day he was struggling with one data set, and he thought, oh, maybe I should change this number 3 to number 5, and then I will get the significant result that I'm looking for. And that was the first step that led him to his complete downfall, which he describes in his memoir, which is kind of distressing to read, but also might be interesting, because obviously we want to avoid this. The second reason to absolutely avoid data fabrication at all costs, because in order to fabricate data that would look plausible, you need to have much higher qualification than to actually conduct the study. If you've read some papers where people analyze the results of Russian elections, you know what kind of approaches, statistical approaches, very simple, we can use to actually detect non-genuine data. And these recipes are known to electoral mathematicians, analytics. They are also known to finance auditors, people who analyze financial reports. There are very simple laws like Benford's law, the probability laws, and so on, which we can use to detect fraudulent data. It's not so difficult to detect fraudulent data. It's almost impossible to concoct data that would look genuine. So never even consider this possibility. But between those two circles of hell, the deepest circle of data fabrication and the kind of higher up circle of self-plagiarism, there is also a bunch of circles that are called questionable research practices. And questionable research practices are actually practices that during the 20th century, they were considered like not really good things to do, but not really criminal. And some researchers actually did them because they were unaware that this is something that might have very harmful consequences for science. But during the last 2 decades, after some very notorious cases, we discovered that those questionable research practices can actually result in biased conclusions. They can harm the integrity of our scientific knowledge. So nowadays, they are also considered criminal. What are those practices? First of all, when the researcher does not report some dependent variables or some studies or some experimental conditions relevant to the research question, you report only a part of the information that you got from your data. Of course, the other part might be irrelevant, but if it's directly relevant to your research question, if you don't report it, your picture of reality is biased. Instead of the full distribution of results, you present only half. You have used 5 questionnaires to measure your dependent variable, and only one of them produced the desired effect. But you need to report all 5, unfortunately. And this was acknowledged after the case of Daryl Bem, who published his famous paper in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology on extrasensory perception. And then when people started to investigate it, they could not find any flaws in the paper itself. But then it became known, and Daryl Bem acknowledged himself that during early stages, when he collected his first experimental studies, he did not save the data from the studies which he considered failed. So in the end, the studies that made it to his paper were not a random sample of all results, but were kind of a selection of results. And again, he was not aware that this can have such consequences, but as a result, his effects were overestimated and people were unable to replicate his findings. That's why we still don't believe that extrasensory perception exists, although it would be extremely exciting for me personally to have it proven. The second questionable research practice is when during the data collection, we look at our data, we test our hypothesis, and we make decisions whether we should collect more data or whether we should stop maybe too earlier than we expected. Why this is a poor research practice? Well, because every statistical result is basically a matter of chance. So at some point when you have collected maybe 100 participants, just due to chance, your result may not be significant. With 110 participants, your result due to chance might be significant. But in reality, it might be somewhere in between, or it might be not significant. So if you say, I will collect another 5 or 10 participants to make sure I get significant result, because it's not significant now, this is a very bad research practice. The correct practice is to plan your sample size before you start data collection and stick to this sample size that you have planned. The third questionable research practice is when the researcher excludes some data points to improve the significance of their results. Or maybe they modify their data cleaning procedure to influence the significance of hypothesis tests. Again, this was completely okay for many years. But now we know that even without our awareness, this may bias our conclusions. For example, we exclude people who we think gave non-genuine answers, or we modify the criterion for exclusion after we test our hypothesis. This might result in biased results. This is why the correct approach is to plan your data cleaning, plan your data analysis before you actually start it, and stick to this plan. And the fourth questionable research practice is when we formulate hypotheses to fit with the results, harking, or we test all possible hypotheses to maybe get something significant. Like, I have 20 variables, I will just correlate all of them, even though I did not plan for these correlations, but if something emerges, maybe I will report it. This is called data fishing or p-hacking. You can see also an article on Wikipedia which describes this whole practice and why it's harmful. And we will also come back to this later on. How can we actually prevent people from engaging in these questionable research practices? Luckily, the scientific community has developed this strategy which aims to combat the replication crisis. Because if we don't fight questionable research practices, our science will be undermined. Our results might not be replicable. That's why now there is new practice which is called pre-registration. When you design your study, you write down all the steps that you will use to arrive at your results. Your data collection steps, your data analysis steps, and your specific hypothesis that you're going to test. And you publish this pre-registered protocol in some open repository, for example, on the Open Science Framework website or in SciArchive, anywhere. And only then you collect your data. And then when you analyze it, you stick to this original protocol. Maybe some people even publish their R scripts to analyze their data before they actually collect their data, and then they run those scripts. But this might be a bit of an overkill. Of course, this does not allow to completely eradicate questionable research practices, but at least it minimizes them to some acceptable extent. And of course, we are also required to publish our raw data together with those pre-registered protocols. So the completely open science approach is to publish your pre-registered protocol, publish your raw data, and hopefully your paper in this open repository, so that everyone who wants to verify your results will have the option to do it. So when you are writing a research paper, you might also refer to the American Publication Association publication guidelines, which gives us, in that publication manual, there is this ethical compliance checklist. But it's kind of straightforward. Make sure you have permission to use other people's instrument procedures or data or any copyrighted material like drawings in your publication. Make sure you cited other people's published work. Make sure you are prepared to answer questions about institutional review of your study or studies. So you might take the risk that no one is going to ask that question, but if you are taking this risk, make sure that in your paper you describe your informed consent procedures, maybe even the privacy and confidentiality if the study was not anonymous, because otherwise editors might definitely ask you the question about informed consent, and then the institutional review, and then you will have a hard time. Have all the authors reviewed the manuscript and agreed on responsibility for its content? Have you protected the confidentiality of people, organizations, or others who were the source of information? So if you collected the data in an organization, unless the organization has read the report and wants you to mention their name, don't do it. protect their confidentiality, because the organization might not be happy with this fact. Have all authors agreed on the order of authorship and who goes as author and who goes in acknowledgements. This is also very important to negotiate before you publish your paper, and sometimes even before you conduct the study. Especially in large cross-cultural studies, it's usually important to have a document which describes how the authorship will be credited after the data analysis and publications. Otherwise, some people might not be happy, and it will be very hard to deal with this kind of issue. And another requirement of the APA is that you need to be prepared to share your data with other researchers who will want to test your conclusions. So by default, you're required to store your data for, I think, 3 years after the publication. And to share it with anyone who is interested in it. But nowadays, the journals are increasingly asked to publish your data in open repositories before you actually submit your paper. So also be prepared to do it. Of course, you can say that I have some confidential data in my data, but then you need to have a really good reason not to publish your data. So regardless of whether you did go through an IRB, you need to make sure that you used the procedures to protect the rights of participants, that you used informed consent debriefing, and you protected their data. Also, try to ensure that you don't violate academic integrity, that the data are correct, and that your analytic steps are described correctly. Conflicts of interest are disclosed. In a student work, probably this is not going to happen, but if you are conducting the study on behalf of some organization, this organization might be motivated in a particular result. And if you're an employee of that organization, that's a conflict of interest. You need to mention it, you need to disclose it when you submit your paper, and then the editors and the readers will be able to put your findings in context. It does not mean that if you have a conflict of interest that your paper is not publishable, but if you have a conflict of interest, you need to disclose it. And you need to ensure that the copyright is not violated. No plagiarism, permissions to use other people's instruments, and authorship and affiliations are all stated correctly. So this was just a general excursion to the scientific hell and to the heaven of research ethics. And we really need this excursion to make sure we don't face painful consequences of not being aware of research ethics. As always, I propose some literature that you can read on the structure of scientific theories, or on research ethics, or on the quality criteria for a theory article. But then again, like always, this literature is not like an absolutely essential assignment, but it's a field for your exploration. So try to maybe skim and pick and choose something that you feel like is interesting for you and is useful potentially for your future scientific career. Obviously, if you have time, you can go through everything, and then I will be very happy. But for today, I would like to thank you for your kind attention. Thank you for bearing with me for these 2 hours. I'm sorry not for being more concise, and see you soon at our 3rd lecture, where we will discuss data sources and samples. How can we collect our data? Where can we recruit our participants? How can we motivate them? So we are approaching the more practical aspects of conducting a research study. And have a good day or have a good night. See you soon.